Alright, econ folks, topic of discussion this week is going to be international trade, global trade, and how it is that it operates. Alright? So, first of all, we know that countries trade with each other. The United States trades with a whole bunch of people, and we'll look at how that works out here in a moment, at least as far as amounts go. But the reason the nations trade is because every country, no matter who they are, wants to have different resources. Right? Remember that whole scarcity problem, right? Limited resources satisfy unlimited wants. Well, this is what leads us to trade, is because each one of us, each country, has different types of resources. Land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, so different natural resources, different types of labor, different man-made resources. And so that means that we're going to be better at making some stuff than others. Not necessarily better in the sense that it's going to be like a better quality product, but better in the sense that we have less opportunity cost. We have to give up less of something else in order to be able to make something. Okay, which means we have an efficiency advantage if we have a lower opportunity cost in producing things. And this is what we call, specialization in trade. All right. Comparative advantage. We got a couple of ideas here. The first is going to be absolute advantage. Absolute advantage is the idea that you can simply make the most of something. Comparative advantage is that you can make it with the least opportunity cost versus somebody else. Now, when it comes to if we're going to make something and trade, what we care about is going to be the comparative advantage, that we can do it with lower opportunity costs. A good example of this, let's say we're talking about corn and bananas. And we got the United States and we have Guatemala. Okay. Now, the U.S., we could say, could make both more corn and more bananas than Guatemala could. But are we going to produce both those things? Well, no, we're going to focus on the corn. Why focus on the corn? Well, we can grow a whole lot of corn in the United States, but we give up very few bananas in order to grow all that corn. Our opportunity cost for producing corn is very low because our resources are very good for corn and very bad for bananas. Now, we could grow bananas. Sure, we could, build greenhouses in Nebraska and Iowa and all this stuff, but we're not going to get very many bananas out of it, but we lose a whole lot of corn in order to produce those few bananas. So our opportunity cost for producing corn is very low. Our opportunity cost for producing bananas is very high. And then if you look at Guatemala, it's the opposite, right? Guatemala can produce a whole lot of bananas and give up very little corn, or they can grow corn and give up a whole lot of bananas, okay? So what do? Well, we focus on growing corn, they focus on growing bananas, and then we trade with each other. As a result, both countries wind up with more of both things than what they could have had on their own. Every once in a while, you get this idea, right? If you remember your world history, was called mercantilism. North Korea has this idea called juche, right? Or protectionism or some sort, right? The idea here is that, we want our country to be self-sufficient. It's going to produce everything on its own and not import anything, right? And we're going to export those as much as we can, right? We don't want to import. We'll export everything that we can, right? But we'll be self-sufficient otherwise. And so countries sometimes get this bright idea of trying to do this, thinking this is a way to make wealth, and it winds up being a losing scenario. It winds up being very inefficient because now they're trying to produce everything on their own and they're not good at it, right? And scarcity is raising its ugly head and opportunity cost is raising its ugly head. And you wind up having to give up things or produce other things that you want, right? And the things you're producing more inefficiently, where you have a higher opportunity cost, that means you have to give up a whole lot of other stuff, right? It's much more efficient on both a nationwide basis as well as an international and global basis to engage in trade, right? Everybody winds up being benefited by it, right? Or I shouldn't say everybody winds up being benefited by it. It's generally overall beneficial for countries, right? Even as a society, right, individuals within society do this. So we don't try to make everything on our own, right? I'm thinking about everything that I have, right? I'm thinking of my house and my car and electronics and all that other good stuff. I'm not at all capable of producing all of that on my own, right? Even as individuals within society, we specialize and we trade with each other. Instead of trying to make everything on our own, we specialize in doing one thing. We trade that labor, whatever it is we're doing, for money, and then we trade that money for things that other people have specialized in doing, where they have comparative advantages in doing that, all right? So even within a society, we trade with each other and we specialize in doing things, and then we trade with each other, and we wind up with so much more than what we're capable of doing on our own, right? So my ability to consume is far greater than my ability to produce because I specialize in trade, right? Same for you. Okay. Now, imports and exports for the United States. The world's largest importer is the United States. We used to be the world's largest exporter, but no surprise there. That is now China. We're the second biggest exporter, with Germany being a close number 3. All right, and our main trading partners are China, Canada, and Mexico. Canada and Mexico, of course, makes sense. They're right next door. So if you look at this map right here, this shows you the biggest importers in the world and the amount, the value of the imports for each one of those countries. So over here for the U.S., we import nearly $2.6 trillion worth of stuff per year. China's $2.1 trillion, Germany's $1.3 trillion, right? They have all these other guys around there. If you want to look at the biggest exporters, here you have it. So the U.S. exports $1.7 trillion of stuff per year, goods and services. You got China at $2.5 trillion, right? You got Germany at $1.6 trillion, and again, all these other guys. Since China is one of our biggest trading partners, this shows you the biggest imports and exports for us between the U.S. and China. So over here on the left side, this is importing stuff into the U.S. from China. So telephones make up the big part, right? Automatic data processing machines, etc. Right, and then these are the things that we export to China. They're the highest value categories. And this shows you the trade deficit, right? A trade deficit, a trade balance, and this will come up again at the end, but a trade balance is the value of exports minus imports. So if you export more than you're importing, in terms of value, we will call that a trade surplus. Because if you're exporting more than you're importing by value, that means you have more money coming in than you have money going out, right? Because when you export goods, money comes in. Okay, when you import, money goes out. So if you're exporting more than you're importing, that means you're running a trade surplus. More money is coming in than is going out. Okay, if you're running a trade deficit, that's the opposite. You have more money going out than what you have money coming in, right? Because you're importing more stuff, so you have more money leaving than you have money coming in from exporting. Okay. So this shows you the trade deficit for the U.S. This is negative millions of dollars. So 70,000 right there is actually $70 billion, right? And this would be $60 billion, and this is in the negative. So when you see it going up like this means the trade deficit is getting worse, which means we're importing more than we're exporting. So you see we hit this high here in 2008. This is before the big 2008 meltdown. You see how much that cratered trade for the U.S. Right, deficit went up to right around there. We were fairly even for a while, and you can see where things have standing recently, right? So the trade deficit, especially here when 2020 came on, has gone up considerably, but it was even on the trend line upwards previous to that. Okay. All right. This shows you the biggest import category for each one of the states. So the biggest import category for Texas here, right? Crude oil. See what it is for these other guys, engine parts, etc., etc. You can pause that and take a look if you want. All right, this is the biggest export category for each one of the states. All right, highest value export. This shows you the biggest trading partner for each one of the states. So you can pause that, take a look. Okay, so the biggest exporting states, Texas is number 1, largely because of oil that we export, especially out of Houston. But biggest trading partners, right? Top 3 destinations: Canada, Mexico, China. You can see the stuff that we're exporting, blah, 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 blah. Okay, I came across these graphs. I found them entertaining. So importing and exporting booze, basically. So spirits, these would be, I think of rum, whiskeys, all that stuff. So it shows you the imports and exports for each one of those categories. Right. And further, like I said, you can pause this stuff, pay attention to it if you want to. I'll keep going. Fresh and chilled beef, right? We export, import all sorts of things, as well as frozen beef and where it's coming from. Yeah, we import and we do export this stuff as well. In fact, my brother is a trucker. He's an over-the-road trucker, long-haul guy. And one of his big things that he gets assigned to do is transporting frozen meat, basically, especially pork, out to one of the ports for the U.S. So a lot of times he's transporting it. He's based out of Topeka, Kansas. So he usually takes meat out of Kansas City and transports it to either the port of Oakland on the West Coast, the port of Houston, or the port of Charleston out on the East Coast. So he makes a lot of runs out to each one of the three coasts for exporting frozen pork. I also like this one. This is Mardi Gras throw beads. So the number of containers, shipping containers worth of Mardi Gras throw beads that we import every year. So this one company right here imports nearly 48 shipping containers worth of cheap plastic beads to be thrown around on Mardi Gras. Okay, now trade and employment here. When we do specialize in trade, one of the risks that we wind up having is jobs move around, right? Because if another country is able to produce something more efficiently than what the U.S. can, well, what's going to happen? It's going to be produced there instead of here. So what will happen to the jobs here is that they go away. This can create structural unemployment. Okay, and you've got a couple of choices here. You either need to learn new skills to become structurally unemployed that are going to be in use where you are, or you're going to wind up having to go somewhere else. All right, so maybe you can go to a different part of the country, or who knows, maybe you'd have to leave completely. Right? Obviously, that's not desirable, but this is one of the big downsides, is that people can lose jobs depending on when the nature of the economy changes, especially when there's going to be trade that occurs, right? So short term, there can be a whole lot of pain, no question about it. Long term, it usually winds up being beneficial because you're able to use the labor resources in your country even more efficiently than we could before. So instead of using it to inefficiently produce something in your country, other labor is being used to efficiently produce it in another country, and you can use the labor that is now freed up within your country to produce something that you do more efficiently. Okay, so in the long term, it can wind up being beneficial, but you can't underestimate or just toss aside the short-term pain and problems they can cause in unemployment. Okay, now because of this, the short-term pain, sometimes countries will try to erect trade barriers, and these are exactly what it sounds like, barriers to trade, typically trying to reduce the amount of foreign competition that is going to be imported into the U.S. Okay, so this is all about trying to make imported goods more expensive than what they otherwise would be. If the imported goods are more expensive, then that gives you an advantage for your domestic producers. They don't have as much foreign competition, which means they don't have to sell things at as low a price as what they'd be forced to if they were exposed to that greater, cheaper foreign competition. So what we can do is an import quota, and this is where you simply set a number, right? So we're going to import so many pairs of, let's say, shoes that were made in China. After we hit that many pairs, we're going to cut it off completely. Either that or we'll set a tariff on every amount over that will escalate. All right, so therefore foreign shoes would be more expensive and your domestic shoe producers would have an advantage. All right. Another type is a voluntary export restraint. Now, this will sound a little bit weird, but this is going to be where a country will voluntarily limit how much they export to a different country, which seems counterintuitive because normally a country wants to export as much as they can to another country. The reason they might do this, though, is because they want to offset the possibility of having to have a big tariff put on their goods. An example of this is Japanese cars in the 1980s. What was happening in the 1970s is that American auto manufacturing wasn't doing too well. Oil was especially a problem because the price of oil was going up due to the OPEC oil embargo and other actions, which meant the price of gas was getting more expensive, and a lot of U.S. cars were very fuel inefficient, and they're also becoming unreliable. So in the early 80s, Americans were increasingly turning towards cheaper automobiles, especially those from China. That were already more reliable and more fuel efficient than what the American offerings were. This worried the U.S. government, especially when there was a bad recession in the early 80s, and so they threatened to put a massive tariff on imported Japanese cars. So the Japanese government made an agreement with the U.S. government where they were going to voluntarily limit how many Japanese cars they exported to the U.S. And by doing that, they were able to keep the U.S. government from putting a massive tariff on Japanese cars. So there you go, 1980 Toyota Corolla. Nice little automobile right there. There you got a Honda hatchback. Okay, so starting in 1981, Japan limited its exports to the U.S. by to just 1.68 million cars, and then it went away from there until eventually 94. It went away altogether. This had odd side effects that people weren't expecting at the time. One of the things the Japanese car companies figured out is, well, this export restraint only applies to cars that we export to the U.S. If we manufacture the cars in the U.S., it doesn't count against their quota. So therefore, they started opening up manufacturing plans to produce Japanese cars within the U.S. Not only that, but they started producing luxury cars because luxury cars are higher value. If you only export so many cars to the U.S., you want some of them to be worth more so you can make more money. So Toyota started Lexus, Honda started Acura, right, and Nissan started Infiniti. So some of these luxury brands came about as a way to get around some of the export restraints. All right. You'd also just do a straight-up tariff, a tax on imported goods. One of my favorite examples of this is sugar. The price of sugar per pound in the U.S. is higher than what it is anywhere else in the world. It costs about twice as much per pound. And this is largely because of tariffs and other things that have been put on the price of sugar to purposely make it more expensive in the U.S. Big sugar companies in the U.S. have pushed for these tariffs to give them a competitive advantage and reduce foreign competition. Corn industry also presses for it. Because the price of sugar is high in the U.S., what do we use as a sweetener? We use high fructose corn syrup. So the corn industry is also in favor of high price sugar because it makes for a massive new market for corn, high fructose corn syrup and everything. But this is why you see high fructose corn syrup being used as a sweetener and everything in the U.S. and everybody elsewhere in the world uses sugar, is because the price of sugar is kept intentionally high in the U.S. to benefit domestic sugar producers as well as domestic corn producers, right, and give them an advantage. Okay, and you see the politics involved here, right? Sugar producers, they give a lot of money to politicians in order to try to keep this game going. All right, moving on. Other barriers to trade you could do is licensing fees or product safety standards or something like this, where you're not directly limiting the imports. Instead, you're doing other things that will make the imports more expensive, right? Make the cost of doing business in the U.S. more expensive than what it otherwise would be. Now, it doesn't mean that all safety standards are bad. We probably don't want to go back to lead paint, right? That'd be another story I don't have time to get into. All right, but we used to put lead in paint, and that was a problem because babies would eat it. And apparently lead has a little bit of a sweet flavor. We used to put lead in gasoline also, if you didn't realize that. That's why if you go to gas stations, sometimes it'll be called unleaded gasoline. That's because regular gasoline had lead in it. Problem with that is that it created atmospheric lead once you burned the gas, and that was also bad. This is a joke advertisement right here, but you can look at that. All right. So the idea behind all this stuff is protectionism, right? You protect domestic industries, you protect domestic jobs from foreign competition. So you make the foreign competition more expensive, so therefore you benefit your domestic producers. Now, my argument is this is all a losing proposition. It's not good for you, right? It sounds nice in the short run, like, oh, we're going to protect domestic producers, all this stuff, but really it's just cost shifting. You're shifting costs away from these producers, these domestic producers you're trying to benefit, and you're shifting it over to other people. Okay, one of the groups you're shifting over to is consumers, right? If you're making goods more expensive, that means consumers have to pay more. And it also means the consumers are effectively impoverished. Okay, now what I mean by that is made poorer than what they otherwise would. So if protectionism means that I have to pay more for, let's say, a washing machine, all right, so if we put tariffs on imported washing machines or on the steel that is used to make washing machines in the U.S., both of which were done, by the way. So if I have to pay $100 more for a washing machine, that means that I have to pay, I don't have $100 I can now spend on something else, right? So I have less. I still have the washing machine, but now I don't have $100 worth of other things that I would have had otherwise because I had to put it in the washing machine instead. Effectively, I am made poorer because I have less goods and services than what I otherwise could have had. All right, so you're shifting it over to the consumers. Well, you're also shifting it over to other manufacturers because now they have to pay more for stuff. So let's say you increase the price of steel and aluminum, that means that other manufacturers have to pay more for the steel and aluminum, which means that they don't have as much money they could have invested in their business or hired as many workers or whatever, right? Even the aluminum tariffs we've put on, oddly enough, it's hurt breweries, it's hurt soda manufacturers because the price of aluminum cans has gone up so much, right? So it's really just cost shifting. You think you're benefiting these people over here, and you might, but you're also going to wind up hurting these other entities over here, other companies and consumers. So it sounds nice, but really you're just moving costs around, right? You're making things more expensive for certain groups while making it better for others. So you haven't made anything really better overall, right? If anything, you just benefited a few companies and hurt everybody else in the process. So these trade restrictions and trade barriers oftentimes are not good. Okay. Not only that, but going to lead to trade wars, which we're kind of in with China at the moment, right? So you put a tariff on the other people's goods, they respond by putting a tariff on some of your stuff, and it just goes back and forth, and nobody winds up winning, right? Everybody winds up losing as a result. Yep. So trade wars and trade barriers are not going to be a good thing. The trend since World War II has been towards freer trade. Now, one of the reasons it started after World War II was not just rebuilding, it was also about more peace. The more countries trade with each other, when we have freer trade, countries trade more with each other and become more economically intertwined and economically interdependent. The more economically interdependent you are on another country, the less likely you are to go to war. It doesn't mean it won't be on the list of possibilities or list of options, but it will be much lower down on the list of options than what otherwise would be, right? You want to do other stuff to resolve your disputes, your political disputes, before resorting to war because it would result in such economic damage, right? So like we may have issues with China. We don't want to go to war with China. They want to go to war with us, right? We buy a whole bunch of their stuff, right? Which means it's beneficial for both of us. We get cheap stuff and they have something to sell too. All right. So free trade zones became more common. These are some of the major ones. NAFTA, which is getting replaced, all right, with a different version. You got this one down here, African Free Trade Zone. You got the European Union, China Special Economic Zone, Asian zone down here. Okay, and NAFTA, people complained about it, but it was actually good for trade in Texas. So you see trade in Texas, the orange bar, versus trade outside of Texas, everywhere in the U.S. except for Texas. You see how much it benefited after NAFTA took effect, right? Because NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, created more free trade between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Since Texas sits here on the border, that means we were primed to trade a whole lot with Mexico, and we benefited quite a bit because of it. All right, so exporting is big for Texas, especially when it comes to petroleum. That's one of the biggest export categories. And we have a whole lot more value and jobs that are involved in exports industries than any other state. Okay. Now, a couple of last things to talk about here. We have exchange rates. Exchange rates are what determine a value of a currency compared to another one. And it has to do with supply and demand, right? How much do people want to get rid of that currency versus how much are people trying to get a hold of that currency? The more people want that currency, the more valuable it is. And the less people want that currency, the less valuable it is, right? So one currency versus another one, supply and demand between the two. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about it, but if a currency increases in value, we call that appreciation. If a currency decreases in value, we'll call that depreciation. All right. So we got this stuff right here. This is an exchange rate table. This is what it was as of this morning on November 6th, 2020. So what this shows right here is $1 US is worth 0.84 euros, and 1 euro is worth 1.18 US dollars. So this means the euro is worth more than the dollar. Right? If you go down here, this Swiss franc, right? Or how about this, the Malaysian ringgit? So 4.12 Malaysian ringgits per US dollar, and 1 Malaysian ringgit is worth 0.24 US dollars. All right. So all that stuff right there, right? We have what's called a floating point exchange rate, which means that it's not fixed to each other. It's the supply and demand of each currency compared to another one. And this can have trading effects. If your currency is worth more, that means you can afford to import more. However, more valuable currency means that your exports are more expensive. You will export less to other countries, right? And if your currency is weaker, A weaker currency means your stuff is cheaper for others, so you'll export more, but you can't afford to import as much. So some people say, well, is it better to have a stronger or weaker currency? The answer is yes. It just kind of depends on what you're looking for. All right. So stronger currency means you can buy more of other people's stuff, but you can't export as much, and vice versa. All right, so balance of trade, we talked about that earlier, right? So the imports versus the exports. This is where we saw the trade deficit going up quite a bit. And I'll just go through that quickly right there because we're already going a little bit over time. So let's stop.